Okay, let's begin. Welcome. I am Mark Wallum. I'm ALBA's Executive Director. And on behalf of ALBA, I'd like to welcome you to this event entitled Telling Our Stories. I'll begin with just a few brief remarks. We expect this event to last about 1 hour. We'll begin with the presentations by our guest speakers, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. Today's program is being recorded and will be posted for viewing on our YouTube channel shortly after the event concludes. If you do not wish to be seen, we suggest you turn off your video function. This event is a Pride Month event, the third annual Pride event that ALBA has conducted. ALBA is determined to continue our advocacy and openness in the face of fascist threats against the LGBT community. As a gay man myself, I'm convinced that one of the most important actions we can take is to continue to tell our stories out loud and without apology. In that same vein, I'd like to encourage all of us in this critical election year to register and vote and participate actively in community and political affairs. I'd like to remind all New York residents that today is primary election day, and if you haven't voted yet, the polls are open until 9 p.m. Today's program is part of the Perry Rosenstein Cultural Series, which ALBA is sponsoring in honor of the late humanitarian and philanthropist. Perry died in 2020 at the age of 94, but his legacy lives on. The Puffin Foundation's generosity plays a large role in making these programs possible. Your generosity does also. So please consider a donation to ALBA so that we can continue our work. A link to our donation page is being posted in the chat. I want to thank our partner, Tamiment Library, who is partnered with us in hosting this event, and to introduce our two guest speakers, starting with Shannon O'Neill, who is the curator for the Tamiment-Wagner Collections at NYU Special Collections, a department within NYU Libraries, and the repository responsible for the ongoing care, preservation, and access to the Abraham Lincoln Archives collection and collections of numerous Spanish Civil War veterans. She joined NYU in August of 2019. Prior to NYU, she worked at Barnard College Archives and Special Collections as its director, and the Los Angeles Public Library and Atlantic City Free Public Library. As of May 2024, she has completed a master's in public history at NYU's Archives and Public History program. And in her honor, I'm going to hit the party reaction and say, congratulations, Shannon, big achievement, okay? That's great. Shannon is also a member of ALBA's Board of Governors. Bettina Aptheker, we are honored to have her with us. She is a distinguished professor emerita, Feminist Studies, University of California, Santa Cruz, where she taught for more than 40 years and had over 17,000 students in the course of her career. An activist scholar, she co-led the free speech movement at UC Berkeley in 1964 and the National Student Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam. She was a member of the Communist Party from 1962 to 1961. She has been part of the LGBT movement since the late 1970s. She has published several books, including Communists in Closets, Queering the History 1930s to 1990s, which will be a centerpiece of the presentation that she makes and that I personally have read most of now and I have find very, very fascinating, and I recommend it. And a link is being posted if you have not purchased the book and would like to get it, please consider doing so. Also, she has published The Morning Breaks, The Trial of Angela Davis, Tapestries of Life, Women's Work, Women's Consciousness, and the Meaning of Daily Experience, and a memoir, Intimate Politics, How I Grew Up Red, Fought for Free Speech, and Became a Feminist Rebel. That book was nominated for a Lambda Literary Award in 2006. She and her wife, Kate Miller, have been together since 1979. They live in Santa Cruz. I also want to mention that we will present a short video of tributes to LGBT vets that is narrated by longtime friend of ALBA, Joan Balter, who I believe is in the audience today, and I want to thank her for this video and for her longstanding support. So now on with the show. Do start thinking about questions you may have, and you can post them in the chat when you think of them. My colleague, Dennis Meany, who I want to thank for, as always, for his partnership and essential work on these programs, will then call on you to ask your questions when we get to the Q&A session a little bit later. So without further ado, thank you again for coming. Shannon, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. All right, I'm going to share my screen and whoops, there we go. Can you all see that okay? Let me go to presenter view. There we go. How does that look? Okay?
We're Shannon, we're seeing the notes.
You're seeing the notes. Okay.
You may want to
Now?
there you go. And then maximize the video screen. Perfect.
All right. Do you still see my notes now?
Yes.
Yes.
You do. Okay, hold on. Sorry, it's funny. It worked before and now I'm struggling. Let me stop the share and try it again. Sorry about that, y'all.
Shannon, if you'd like, I can share, and then you could just tell me when to go.
Yeah, that sounds great. Let's do that.
A second.
Okay, I'm ready whenever you are.
Should be seeing it now.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry about that, everybody. Little technical difficulties. It's really lovely to be here this afternoon during this final week of Pride Month and to be amongst friends and collaborators and donors and researchers and the extended community that comprises the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives. Thank you, Mark, for the invitation to participate today, and thank you to Mark and Dennis for their coordination on this event, and thank you, Dennis, for the technical assistance. And a final thank you to Bettina Aptheker for her beautiful book, Communists in Closets, Queering the History 1930s to 1990s, and the incredible knowledge I know that she's going to share with us. As Mark said in his very kind introduction, I'm Shannon O'Neill. I'm the curator for the Tamiment Library and Robert F. Wagner Labor Archives, which is home to a constellation of records and individual collections that together make up the physical materials of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives. I'm really grateful to kick off this event by sharing a little bit more about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives collections at NYU, including some information on how you can access them. So next slide, please. So I joined NYU Libraries in this role in 2019, which is the same year that NYU Special Collections went live as a department. And NYU Special Collections is a department within NYU Libraries whose primary objective is to provide access to 3 archival repositories through a range of services such as publicly accessible appointment-based reading room, public programs, teaching, and exhibitions. The 3 distinct collections that make up NYU Special Collections include the Tamiment Library and Robert F. Wagner Labor Archives, of which the ALBA collections are a part, the Fales Library and Special Collections, and the NYU University Archives. Next slide, please. I'll share a few recent photographs of our spaces just to help us visualize together what this unit within the library looks like. NYU Special Collections is located on the 2nd floor of Bope's Library. When you arrive here, you'll first encounter our exhibition galleries, which are currently hosting a show on the history of radical bookstores, which is up through July 31st. Please come by and see it. And you'll also encounter our check-in desk. Next slide. Just beyond this space is our reading room, which is a very active reading room as it serves all 3 repositories. We also provide remote reference services and reproduction services to individuals who are not able to visit in person. Next slide, please. On the east side of the 2nd floor are our 3 classroom spaces, which were designed particularly for us to teach with our collections. They're modular with embedded technology, and they can be reconfigured to a number of different setups that invite various learning experiences and learning styles. Next slide. And during the semester, our classrooms are really quite jam-packed. And in fact, the ALBA collections are some of the collections that I teach with the most. Between the 3 repositories, at least one of these classrooms is being utilized nearly every day of the week. Next slide. Lastly, and sometimes I think most excitingly, the entirety of the 3rd floor of Bope's library has recently been renovated to be wholly archival storage. And in the last year, NYU Special Collections finalized a massive collection move of all of the collections, on-site collections, into this space. I'll keep going. We utilize high density compact storage to maximize space. And we have an expansive and expanded flat file storage system. And really this space was designed for growth, as you may have seen in some of these photographs. While the shelving is relatively full, there's also space for more boxes to be included. Next slide, please. We are open to the public by appointment Mondays through Fridays, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And I'm just going to do a quick overview of how you can find collection material and make an appointment with us. So to search our collections in our Archives Collections search portal, you'll go to specialcollections.library.nyu.edu/search. And in the search bar, you can type in keywords like names, subjects, or places. Next slide. As an example of this, if we were to search for William Bill Alto in the collection search portal, you can see that we have about 10 results that come up for his name. Next slide. And let's imagine that we're interested in this first result, which based on its description appears to be a letter that Bill Alto wrote upon facing discrimination during World War II. Can you go to the next slide? You'll then click on request materials using your Special Collections research account. And so when you click on that link, you're brought to this point of the finding aid where this file exists. And it's within the overarching inventory of the collection's contents. And you can note that this letter is in box 1, folder 1 within series 1 of the collection. So if we want to request that letter, you click on request materials on the left-hand side. Can you go to the next slide, please? Right, and then you'll see here that you can click on request materials using that button there in the center. Next slide, please. So then you'll be brought to a new page where you can log into your Special Collections researcher account or create one if you do not already have one. Next slide, please. And then within your researcher account, you'll see a modified version of that same finding aid. And you'll recall that the letter that you want to see is in box 1 of the collection. And in your researcher account view of the finding aid, you can then click that you'd like to request box 1 from the container list. Next slide. Then you will select a date for your appointment by clicking Create Appointment and selecting a date. And then you'll submit your request. And now you're all set up to come visit us. Next slide, please. So while searching in the catalog and making appointments may come with relative ease, I think it's also important to consider the challenges of researching LGBTQIA histories, and more specifically, LGBTQIA histories within the collections of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade veterans. Archives are a critical tool for the telling of queer histories. They help us to narrativize the past, recover marginalized stories and lives, make space for queer people to locate their experiences within history, and they also allow us to contest the past as it has been written. And the reason we have to, at times, contest the past as it has been written is because history has often been written without queer people in mind. And it can be difficult for queer people to find the records of our communities in the archives, and more so to find records that aren't only about us, but are by us. Often we're left to piece together our histories, and oftentimes we must do so by utilizing records produced by the state or other entities that have done our communities great harm, or even to utilize records that reduce us to stereotypes. So as much as there's queer life in the archives, and as much as we can utilize the archive to amplify or reconnect or revitalize queer histories, the archives can also be a space of dissonance and erasure of queer life as well. Queer lives can be misnamed, misidentified, maligned, or altogether forgotten in the archives. We can see some of this tension in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade archives, where there is both presence and absence. We can ask, like Bettina poses in the title of her introductory chapter to Communists in the Closets, what is found there, or perhaps who is found there? There being the archives and the lives represented within the archives. Next slide, please. In just a moment, we're going to watch an amazing video by Joan Balter, in which Joan recovers and recounts some, surely not all, but some of the gay veterans who fought as a part of the Abraham Lincoln Brigades: William Bill Alto, David McKelvey White, David Gillis Kelly, John George Mayle, and George Redlick. While preparing for this event, I spent some time in our stacks looking at what records I could surface for these 5 individuals. Next slide, please. Of the 5, Bill Alto and David McKelvey White had the largest bodies of records. Here, Bill poses with his pipe, his eyebrow coyly arched, a pocket square tucked in his suit jacket. He appears both professorial and jovial all at once. While the photo is undated, we know it's taken sometime after Alto fought with the Lincoln Brigades and before he joined the United States Army in World War II. We know this because during a World War II training exercise, Alto shielded the soldiers around him when a live grenade was dropped. Alto picked up the grenade with his right hand to throw it in a direction away from the bystanders. He lost the appendage in doing so, but saved the lives of many. In this photo, he gently clutches his pipe with that hand. Next slide. Amidst David Kelvey White's files is a copy of his diary from his last night in Spain before he crossed back over the border. He goes page by page and cuts out the names of people and places who he does not want to get into, quote, unfriendly hands. I don't know what kinds of overlapping or intersecting lives Alto and McKelvey White may have had, but I'm struck here with the similarities of their gestures, both of which are selfless acts to protect another's life. These acts feel all the more heroic, knowing that as gay men both faced discrimination, including being dismissed from professional workplaces and threats of expulsion from the Communist Party. Next slide, please. While we have access to the records of Alto and McKelvey's lives in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade archives, there are no records in the collection that point to the life of George Redlick, and similarly, the life of John George Mayle, who sometimes went by his nickname Jack, is obscured by the archive. In John's vertical file is a simple note, repeated from Carl Geiser's collection, that no records are to be found for John. John does make a brief and, I believe, really kind of sweet appearance, however, in the biographical files of David Gillis Kelly. These biographical files were collected by Carl Geiser as a part of his research for his book, Prisoners of the Good Fight. In the biographical sketch, Geiser paints a tender domestic scene between Mayle and Kelly, albeit one in the midst of a battlefield. Geyser noted, at San Pedro, Kelly and Jack Mayle reported similar dreams of concerts, ballets, and impressionist paintings and savory food. On the wall above their straw pallets hung a menu, artistically done, offering foods more delectable than Maxime's in Paris. Next slide, please. Even amidst these trace presences and amongst these gaping holes of absence, there are moments of queer tenderness, love, and care and solidarity in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade archives. And it's these moments that remind us of what the brigadists were fighting for, freedom. And in 2024, we can be reminded that the fight for anti-fascist freedom has always been entangled with the fight for queer liberation. And now we'll watch Joan Balter's short video, which is a tribute to the LGBT veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Thank you.
I'm Joan Balter, the proud daughter of Lincoln Brigade vet Martin Balter. Balter was my mother's maiden name, and my father took it to be able to work and support the family. He was very accepting of me and very welcoming of my partner when I came out, and also supported my unconventional choice to become a violin maker when that had not been previously a profession for women in the United States. It gives me great pleasure to acknowledge the heroic contributions that the following gay Lincoln vets made to the cause. There were undoubtedly other LGBT vets, but these are the ones we know about. Bill Aalto, a Finnish American from the Bronx, was regarded by his colleagues as one of the finest soldiers in the international brigades. He worked in demolition on secret and dangerous missions behind enemy lines. Amongst his credits was the liberation of a Franco prison camp, freeing over 300 Republican prisoners of war. He returned to New York as a hero and joined William Donovan's elite OSS predecessor of the CIA, along with other former Lincoln vets. Sadly, his former colleagues outed him and refused to work with him, forcing the OSS to dismiss him. There is speculation that they may have done this out of professional jealousy and for opportunistic reasons as much as out of homophobia. Aalto returned to the U.S. Army as a Special Forces trainer. During a training exercise, one of the officers dropped a hand grenade after pulling the pin. Aalto grabbed the grenade to save those around him and lost his right hand when the grenade exploded. Aalto later attended Columbia University, wrote poetry that was published in New Masses, and had an extended personal relationship with the great poet W.H. Auden. He died of alcohol-related illness in 1958. David McKelvey White, the son of an Ohio governor, was an English instructor at Brooklyn College in New York when he volunteered to serve in Spain. Milton Wolfe remembered him as a slender but tough soldier in the machine gun company at Brunete. He was repatriated in 1937 to do political work. He helped found the Veterans of Abraham Lincoln Brigade in 1937 and took over the leadership of the Friends of Abraham Lincoln Brigade. He was highly respected amongst the families of the vets, but faced threats of expulsion from the Communist Party for his homosexuality. He committed suicide in 1945. Some of his papers are held by the New York Public Library. Lincoln vets David Gills from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and John Mayle from San Francisco sailed on the same boat, arriving in Spain in October of 1937. They were captured in Gandesa during the Great Retreats of 1938 and held as prisoners of war. They returned to the United States in May 1939, and together they opened a florist shop. Gills died in 1982, but Mayle's death is not recorded in the archives. George Redlick was underage when he went to Spain from Chicago. He served with the medical group for 6 months in 1937, but was repatriated because of his age and his mother's illness. He worked as an artist for the New Deal's WPA project, and 13 of his paintings from that project are in the Chicago Art Institute collection. He was known in the militant left wing of his local artist colony as gay. He was married and had a child. In 1941, he was killed in an automobile accident.
So next we'll hear from Bettina.
Thank you so much. I wanted to thank Joan for that wonderful presentation, which I had watched before, and also to thank Shannon for her marvelous presentation. I want to tell you that it is a great pleasure for me to be with you today, celebrating Pride and celebrating the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. I'm so happy for the opportunity to share some of the stories from my recent book, Communists in Closets, 1930s to 1990s, Queering the History, and especially the historic connections to the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. I kind of highlighted them as I put this presentation together. This echoes what Shannon just said about the archives. My book is the result of about a decade of archival research, which began in 2010 when I was on sabbatical from UC Santa Cruz and teaching at NYU in the Women and Gender Studies program. I gave a talk for the program that was based on a paper I had recently published. This is long before the book. And the paper was called Keeping the Communist Party Straight. And what I thought was going to be a small seminar type discussion turned into a mass meeting. So many of the people that showed up, besides NYU students and faculty, who had been in the Communist Party or the Socialist Party or other left and communist political formations. The Q&A following my talk was an amazing experience for me as people shared their experiences and then argued with each other across the room about what had and had not happened. I stood at my podium and said nothing almost at all and just took notes furiously. At the end, many people came up to me and said that I had to write a book. And I was convinced by that experience that there was a rich source of what might be accomplished and how we might redeem some of the heroic work of gays and lesbians in the communist left. I started research here at the Tamiment first, of course, in the files of the Communist Party, to which I was given complete access. And then in the Lincoln Brigade archives and other collections from the New Left and so on. I also spent time in the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe and the Sophia Smith College archives and others. It was a very challenging search, among other reasons, because archives usually don't have a category for gay or lesbian or homosexual or something like that. And if you're in a gay or in the gay and lesbian archives, they don't have a category for communist or socialist. So you're trying to put these things together in some kind of way, and you're going on hunches and ideas about what might bear fruit. It was also very challenging because people were so closeted. They were closeted as communists in many cases, and almost always they were closeted as gay or lesbian. In part, this is because and it feels very counterintuitive, the left in general and the CP in particular was extremely homophobic. The Communist Party banned gays and lesbians from membership, which has already been alluded to in the stories that we've been telling, but they were banned from membership beginning in 1938. The ban ended in 1991, and the first really affirming resolution welcoming gays and lesbians into the Communist Party was not until 2005. I was a member of the Communist Party for 19 years, between 1962 and 1981. For all that time, I was a deeply closeted lesbian, and as was true for many, I was also in a heterosexual marriage for 13 years, and I had 2 children. Writing this book was in many ways a personal journey for me, and because I knew the party as well as I did and people in it, my research was greatly facilitated. The book opens this way. I just wanted to read a little excerpt from it. I came out of the closet with confidence in 1965 as a communist. I had been a prominent member of the leader of the free speech movement at the University of California, Berkeley, the previous year. Now I was running in a student-wide election for a position on the Rules Committee that would govern free speech on campus. I thought the students should know my political affiliation, which at the time was still only semi-legal. I wrote an open letter to the students on the Berkeley campus. It was published on the front page of the Daily Cal. I was 21. The next day, a headline on the front page of the San Francisco Examiner read, "Bettina admits it, she's a red." And I won the election in a landslide. And then the book goes on to explain that coming out as a communist was very easy for me because it was in accord with my whole family heritage and who I was. There was nothing emotionally challenging about it, although I received many death threats and so forth. But what was very emotionally challenging was when I came out as a lesbian. And on the third page of the book, I open up with a discussion or description of falling in love with my partner, Kate Miller, with whom I've been, as was said, since 1979. And she did not internalize all of the homophobia that I did. And I had internalized so much of it because of the homophobia in the Communist Party. But she was raised in North Dakota in a Lutheran German heritage family. And it really says something about how these things operate in terms of the homophobia on the left. So that's a little bit about my personal history. In telling the stories of gays and lesbians of the communist left, I am also telling the story of communist organizing in the 1930s in the Popular Front Against Fascism, in which the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and the struggle in Spain figured prominently for many people. In the late 1940s and 50s, during the height of the McCarthy repression, thousands of communists and thousands of LGBT people lost their jobs, their homes, and in many cases, their families, and were sometimes forced to leave their communities. Others were put on trial and imprisoned. Others were brutalized by police and FBI and under constant surveillance. Others were beaten in gay bashings. Some were killed in the 1930s and 40s. Some were killed, sorry. In the 1930s and 40s, the Communist Party membership was over 100,000. Its cultural magazine, The New Masses, had a circulation in the tens of thousands, and its contributors included everyone from Michael Gold to Langston Hughes, from Theodore Dreiser to William Carlos Williams and Upton Sinclair, to Ernest Hemingway and Richard Wright, Merida LeSueur, Josephine Herbst, and Tilly Olson, and dozens more, many of whom are placed today in the U.S. literary canon. From this point of view, the Communist Party was a significant force on the American left. In spite of the party's homophobic 60-year ban, individual queer members of the party made astonishing contributions to LGBT history and gay liberation, women's history and women's liberation, union organizing and anti-fascist and anti-racist organizing, and Black liberation. Queer communists were teachers, artists, poets, playwrights, composers, journalists, social workers, and union and community organizers. This queer presence is an essential part of communist and radical history in the United States, even as it has been denied or euphemisms are employed to avoid using the word communist, or the queerness is erased. Some of the people whose stories I tell include short, abbreviated biographies in the book, and others are told in whole chapters. So here are a few examples of excerpts of telling our stories. Mark Blitzstein, 1905 to 1954, was a composer and concert pianist. He was of Jewish heritage. He was gay and closeted. He collaborated with Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill, turning their three-penny opera into the musical hit it became when it opened on Broadway. He was mentor to Leonard Bernstein. He wrote the operatic score for The Little Foxes, written by playwright Lillian Hellman. He was deeply involved in the Popular Front Against Fascism, and he wrote the score for the documentary film on the Spanish Civil War called The Spanish Earth, released in 1937. One reviewer in the New York Herald called it, quote, the most powerful and moving documentary film ever screened, close quote, and lauded what he called, quote, its brilliant musical accompaniment. In addition, Blitzstein gave many benefit concerts to raise money for the Spanish Republic and the Brigade. He joined the Communist Party in 1938, its homosexual ban notwithstanding, and left it in about 1948. However, he always held on to his anti-fascist, radical, pro-working class, and anti-racist political views. He became an overnight celebrity in 1937 when his opera, The Cradle Will Rock, opened in New York amid controversy and chaos. It was on opening night at a Broadway, it was supposed to open at a Broadway theater. It was canceled by the theater management at the very last minute. A crowd of ticket holders was already gathered outside waiting admission. Blitzstein and the crew of actors and musicians that included as director the great Orson Welles, who was also a great partisan of the Lincoln Brigades, raced around and found a theater further uptown. It opened that night, a couple of hours late, in a larger venue with a packed hall. One reviewer characterized it as, quote, the most exciting evening of theater in New York has seen in a generation. The reason for the controversy? The opera supported the right of the steelworkers to organize a union and to strike until their demands were won. In the early 1960s, Blitzstein was commissioned by the Metropolitan Opera to compose an opera. He decided his opera would be based on the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, which I assume many of you are familiar with, two working-class anarchist Italian immigrants framed on a murder charge and executed by the state of Massachusetts in 1927, despite a massive movement for their exoneration. It is a very dramatic story, making for great opera, especially in the hands of a master like Mark Blitzstein. He had retreated to the island of Martinique to finish it. One evening, he left the house where he was staying and cruised the local bar looking for gay companionship. He encountered a fisherman and arranged for a rendezvous in a nearby alley. In the alley, he was set upon by three men, all of them from the same fishing vessel, and viciously beaten in what can only be described as a gay bashing. He managed to stagger out of the alley to summon help and lived long enough to identify his attackers. He died as the result of a ruptured liver. It was January 22nd, 1964. Leonard Bernstein, with whom he had a deep and lasting friendship, was grief-stricken. He was conducting the New York Philharmonic on the night of January 23rd. He concluded the program with Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. The next morning, a reviewer wrote, the work was performed as if Bernstein was rewriting Beethoven as he went along in order to express his personal grief that was unbearable in its anguished, frenetic intensity. Thinking of Mark Blitzstein's death at the hands of the very working class men to whose liberation he had devoted his life, and feeling Leonard Bernstein's raw grief, I thought of the Kaddish in Jewish tradition. At its conclusion, we say, may his memory be for a blessing. Another story, Harry Hay, 1912-2002, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with him, was the founder of the first gay rights organization in the United States, called the Mattachine Society. In 1951, which was a heck of a time to found a gay organization, much less by communists. He was a Communist Party member from 1938 until 1951, when he resigned, knowing that his gay identity was incompatible with party membership. But even after he resigned, the leadership in New York, in a thoroughly mean-spirited gesture, expelled him to prevent him from ever being able to rejoin. Harry was a musicologist, an erudite Marxist scholar, a screenwriter, a union organizer, especially of farm workers, in his younger days in the Central Valley of California, an anti-fascist who, among many other activities, raised money in Los Angeles to help Jewish refugees fleeing Hitler. He was an ardent supporter of the Spanish Republic in what he saw as the first front in the fight against European fascism. He was charismatic, funny, loving, and adored being gay. It's who he was in the world. Nevertheless, wanting to join the party and knowing they would not allow it, he sought help from a psychiatrist. And I tell you, this is a true story. So he went to a psychiatrist in about 1937, and the psychiatrist advised him to marry, quote, a masculine-like woman, unquote, and assured him he would be fine. Harry wooed a communist woman he knew from the picket lines, who he liked a lot, and who stood about 6 foot in stocking feet. I suppose that was the gesture toward masculine-like woman. Her name was Anita Platke, and they were married in 1938. Then he was allowed to join the party. They were married for 13 years, adopted 2 children, and lived in Echo Park, a neighborhood in Los Angeles well known for being a red enclave. Later in his life, long after his expulsion from the CP, he founded a group called the Radical Fairies, an organization devoted to the joy of being gay and joy of being alive and helping men to heal from all of the internalized self-hating homophobia generated by the dominant culture. And I want to say there's a whole chapter devoted to Harry. It's a very complicated story about Mattachine and what happened to it and even how they founded it in the midst of the 1950s. So I'm not trying to tell the whole story here, but I do want to say that I listened to the oral history that John D'Amelio did with him in the New York Public Library. I had the earphones on and I listened to it for hours and hours and hours, and I just fell in love with the guy. He's amazing. He was an amazing human being. Another person, very briefly, Betty Millard, 1911 to 2010, hailed from a wealthy white family in a suburb near Chicago. She once described herself as a 10-year-old upper-class snob who turned into a 15-year-old communist because of her numerous crushes on girls that cast her outside the bounds of acceptable society. While she actually didn't join the Young Communist League until she was in her 20s, the story speaks to the interior sense of herself as a perennial outsider and revolutionary. As a student at Barnard College in New York, Betty became involved in the Popular Front and in supporting the struggle in Spain. This brought her into the Young Communist League, and a few years later into the Communist Party. After joining the party, Betty went to work as an editor at New Masses. It was 1946, and I'm just going to read you a very brief excerpt from that story because it's very telling in terms of what transpired. The editor of New Masses during Betty's tenure was Joseph North, who had been on the front lines during the Spanish Civil War as a journalist. I remember Joe very well, a rumble, tumble, sharp-talking kind of man with a mop of curly black hair and a powerful boxer-like frame. In her interview with someone else, Betty told a story that said a lot about him and the kind of everyday sexism that saturated daily life in the party and how women navigated it. Joe had gone to lunch with Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and Grace Hutchins, and those were 2 very prominent women in the Communist Party. This was around the time Elizabeth had become chair of the party's National Women's Commission. When Joe came back from lunch, he came into Betty's office. He said, "Betty, do you think I'm a male chauvinist?" "Of course not, Joe." "Why do you ask?" he said. "Well, I just had lunch with so-and-so, and they couldn't understand why there was a masthead full of male names on the New Masses masthead with no women on it. I told them there was no women among the editors, and Elizabeth said, 'Well, of course there is, Betty Millard.' When he presented this to me, I said, 'Well, Joe, of course, I'm not on the masthead. I'm just a minor editor.' I was the youngest. After he left the office, bumming a cigarette on the way out, I started thinking, and the upshot of that was that my name got put on the masthead. But another upshot was I began thinking about the whole question of women in relationship to my life, and it was very revealing to me. I just love that story about Joe North. It's just exactly how I remember him. So what happened was that Betty, as a result of that encounter, published a long essay in New Masses, and then it was reissued as a pamphlet, and it's called Woman as Myth. It's remarkable. It is a Marxist, socialist, feminist analysis of the oppression of women. She published this in 1948, before Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, and a decade before Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique. It was a prescient, extraordinary 24-page bombshell, and it hit the party and the left, and especially many of the women, like a stunning illumination. Through Betty Millard's life, we are able to glimpse the breadth and depth of her efforts and those of other communist women to upend male supremacy and white supremacy and capitalism and imperialism. Among many other things, she edited a monthly news journal called Latin America Today in the 1950s. I was able to procure a copy of one of the issues, August 1954, that featured the struggle to save the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala from a US engineered coup. If you want to know why so many thousands of Guatemalans are fleeing their country today, you can start with Betty's stories in Latin America Today in 1954. Closeted almost her whole life, she lived long enough to witness the flowering of queer culture beginning in the 1970s. And she had written an ecstatic poem decades earlier as a kind of aspiration for her life, and lived long enough to realize its spirit, the last lines of which are, "I shall become everything, poet, cellist, writer of wrongs, woman, I shall be love, embrace love, adore love." Now, while in the Tamiment, I was rummaging through the Abraham Lincoln Brigade archives. I came upon a woman named Frederica Martin. Again, many of you may be familiar with her, and became fascinated with her. And I thought maybe she was a lesbian. She's not. She wasn't. Sigh on my part, but okay. And she led an absolutely remarkable life. And I wanted to say a few things about her today because it fits so much into our topic, and I did so much research on her. Frederica Martin was born June 2nd, 1905 in Cooperstown, New York. After high school, she lived and worked with the St. Margaret Order of Nuns in Jersey City, graduating with honors from the affiliated nursing school of Christ Hospital in 1925. Martin studied Russian and Yiddish. She was profoundly fluent in many languages. That's another feature of her. And in 1935, she visited England, Russia, and Germany and became much more aware of the rise of fascism. When she returned to the United States, she became very active in the Medical Bureau to aid Spanish democracy. This was initially organized to provide medical supplies, food, and clothing to the Spanish Republic. By late 1936, the Bureau was recruiting personnel to send directly to Spain. Frederica Martin volunteered in 1937 and became part of the first American medical unit. She was soon appointed as head nurse in one hospital and later served as an administrator for six hospitals operated by the brigades. She was Dr. Edward Barsky's head nurse. I happen to know Dr. Barsky also. He was a very important part of my childhood. He saved my mother's life. Anyway, she was the head nurse for him and chief administrator for all the American nurses in Spain. Barsky was the chief surgeon and medical officer for the Lincoln Brigade. In February 1938, Martin returned to the United States for a speaking tour to raise support for the Spanish Republic. She toured with the famed writer and public figure Dorothy Parker. After the defeat of the anti-fascist forces and upon her return to the United States, she was invited to establish and direct a hospital in Greenbelt, Maryland, under a federally funded initiative created by the Resettlement Administration. Then in 1940, she married Dr. Samuel Berenberg and traveled with him to the Aleut Islands in 1941, where they lived for a year. She learned the Aleut language and published a grammar titled The Aleut Language, The Elements of Aleut Grammar with a Dictionary in 1944. Forced to return to the United States as the U.S. entered World War II, Frederica Martin divorced and moved in 1950 to Cuernavaca, Mexico, with her 9-year-old daughter, Toby Ann. For the next 40 years, she made her living as a translator, a travel book writer, and an instructor at a Spanish language institute. Most importantly, especially for our purposes today, Martin wrote a book on the Spanish Civil War called Proud Within Ourselves, but it remains, as far as I know, unpublished. The manuscript is in the Tamiment. That archive includes both the unpublished manuscript and also correspondence with scores of veterans who served in the Lincoln Brigade. Martin was a wonderful writer, and I do hope that some future scholars will do whatever editing is needed to finally publish this work. It is simply an extraordinary record of memory, critical assessment, and political acuity. Finally, I want to note that one of Frederica Martin's most significant lifelong friendships was with a sister nurse from the brigade, Anne Taft. After reading many of their letters, I do believe that Anne Taft was in a lesbian relationship with another nurse whose name was Toby, and that they all served together in Spain. Frederica's daughter, Toby Ann, was named after them. More research, please. Thank you so much for our time together, and very happy for the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bettina. That was a great, wonderful presentation. Hi, I don't know. Hello, everybody. My name is Dennis Meany. I'm the executive assistant here at ALBA. So we've arrived at the Q&A portion of the event. So the way this usually works is I've been recording your questions in the chat. Please put some more in there if you have any questions. I'll record them and then call on you. So right now, none of you have the ability to unmute themselves. I'm going to call on the individuals who put questions in the chat, and then you can, if you feel comfortable doing so, ask your question to the panel, and then they will answer, and then I will choose another one. So usually I like to give people a little heads up, but we're jumping right into that. So Bill Rencher, I did want to start with your question because it broadens our topic. So I'm sending you an unmute request right now. You can do so and ask your question to the panel.
Thanks, Dennis. Thank you, Bettina, for that great presentation. My question had to do with other countries' communist parties. Did they have a similar ban on gay and lesbian members as the one in the US? Was it around the same time frame? I'm just curious about what that was like in other countries.
Yes, they did. A lot of this stemmed from, the linkage in the communist parties through the Comintern, the reason for 1938 was, I think, in 1937, under Stalin in the Soviet Union, they criminalized homosexuality, and then as a result of that, it spread the attitudes and the criminalization or the banning of gays and lesbians happened in all the communist parties that were active. However, there are cultural differences. I will say that because, for example, in France, the French culture is a lot more, I would say, understanding or open, or there's a different attitude towards sexuality. So, for example, when Betty Millard was in France in the 1950s, she served with the Women's International Democratic Federation as the U.S. representative, and she was based in Paris for quite a while, for a couple of years. And during that time, she had a ball. I will say, she was very charismatic and very beautiful, and she cut quite a swath through through Europe and through France. But it was easier. It was easier. And although she didn't announce anything, it was a lot easier in Europe than at least in France, and I think also in Italy. So there were that kind of cultural differences. I also came upon gay people in China. That's another part of the book, who worked in China, but they were also closeted. So people were very, very cautious about it, and I would say it was pretty much a universal ban in the communist world.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that question. Thank you, Bettina. Well, I think we're going to go to another question that's sort of about, sort of continuing on this theme of why the institutions took this position. Peter Glazer, where you can ask your question now.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you for the amazing presentation. And Joan, who I think is still here for the video, which I hadn't had a chance to see yet. I mean, maybe there's an obvious answer to this, but you mentioned in your opening remarks that it might be counterintuitive the way that the CPUSA was so, was not allowing membership until after the year 2000. I don't remember the year you quoted. I guess, is it counterintuitive? So what is as far as, someone has mentioned that there were concerns about the vulnerability of people politically if they were deemed to be homosexual. But how do you account for this long-standing disaffection, homophobia around from the CPUSA, given the politics and given their theoretical political inclinations?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And it was one that haunted me when I was doing this. Well, it haunted me in my childhood and my young adulthood, but then I was trying to figure it out. So the first thing is, I'm going to allude to what you said, which is that the party's attitude was, this is in the 50s, the 40s and the 50s, was that gays and lesbians, if they were in the Communist Party, could be blackmailed by the FBI or other government agencies and become informants, be forced to become stool pigeons or informants. And so that was one reason that was given as to why they were banned. But when I got deeper into the archive, the Communist Party archive, I saw that was true. That was absolutely true. But the attitudes toward gays and lesbians were as homophobic, right-wing rhetoric as anything you would find today from the Christian church. And I quote it in the book, and I won't take the time now to try to find it and read it to you, but I quote it in the book it's in the archive, and it's what they said, and it was resolutions that were passed repeatedly at Communist Party conventions. And they heralded the work, it was the idea of the heroic working class family, as though no working class people were ever gay or lesbian, which is ridiculous. But that was what they said, and I think the other reason they were so homophobic was that once gay liberation started, this was true also for women's liberation, people in the leadership of the party started to worry that those movements were going to become to replace that gay liberation or women's liberation was going to replace the primacy of the working class as the vanguard force for liberation. And that was never the intention, as far as I could see anywhere that I was reading, but there was that fear. So I'll just say one other thing. When I was still in the Communist Party, I went to a party meeting that was being held in San Francisco, and I won't name the party person who was there from the national office. I'm not trying to malign anybody, but she was up there on the platform, and she said something very disparaging toward gays and lesbians. And I was sitting next to a man named Buddy Clark, who at the time was in the Communist Party. He's no longer living, but Buddy was gay. He was a gay man. I was still in the closet, and he was a gay man. And a lot of us in the audience started to shout at this Communist Party speaker in the national office. This is San Francisco, see? And we started to shout, "What, we don't believe that here. This Communist Party doesn't approve of that," or something like that. And I think she was quite taken aback at the force of the response. And but it didn't change the policy. In 1991 was when the party fell apart. It collapsed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that was when there was the one Communist Party remained. The traditional Communist Party remained, and then there was the committees of correspondence for peace, democracy, and socialism that split off. And that organization welcomed everybody, gay, lesbian, and people who agreed with the basic premises of that group of peace, democracy, and socialism. And then that forced the Communist Party to change its policy. So that's when it changed in 91. And then I mentioned 2005 because that's the first time I saw a resolution at a national convention in which the party affirmed membership, made an affirmation of membership for gays and lesbians.
Thanks.
Thank you for that great question and answer. We have another question. I'm going to go to Elisa Rose Brown. That's a question on.
Hello, hello, it's Alicia Rose. Hi. So Professor Aptheker, you mentioned how your father told you of two women who were significant in the Communist Party that you knew and that they were lesbian and they were partners. You sort of mentioned how you felt the feeling of like, why wasn't this information told to you? Like you felt like it could have helped you. So there is a section for your longtime friend and comrade, Dr. Angela Davis. Do you know if she ever found her story within the Communist Socialist Party, besides the quote unquote homage to her queer elders and ancestors when she wrote Woman in the Blues?
Yeah, wonderful question. Yes, and you're referencing my father's telling me about Grace Hutchins and Anna Rochester, who were a young, early, and everybody in the party knew that they were a couple, but nobody said anything, and they didn't announce it to anybody. I'm just wanting to sort of put their names out, and a wonderful historian, a lesbian historian named Julia Allen wrote a terrific book about their lives that I highly recommend and I cite in my book. Okay, having said that, in terms of Angela and Angela Davis, she was the last interview that I did in the book. And she has been with her current partner for over 25 years now, whose name is Gina Dent, is also an activist scholar, communist scholar, and they're both very active in the prison abolition movement. I think, as Angela says in the interview, she feels that sexuality is fluid, and also that gender identity is fluid. She makes those points about the fluidity of both. And there was an exhibit of her lifetime work at the LGBT Historical Society in San Francisco, but in that exhibit there was no mention of her sexuality. So she has what she says, she has wanted to really focus her life and her work on the the prison abolition movement, the anti-imperialism, anti-fascist, movements, the anti-racist movements. And so she doesn't identify herself all the time with the gay and lesbian movement. That's with the gay liberation movement. That's what I would say in response. And there are other places you asked, yes, in her book, because I cite the book, you're exactly right, Blues Legacies. In that book, she talks about the lesbian lyrics, the sexuality of the blues singers. She's very open about it. And she also has given many wonderful talks about the great Audre Lorde, and who's very well known as a Black lesbian feminist writer from the, starting in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, until her untimely death. So she's very affirming of that. I think another story I tell in the book about her is we were at a conference on the Black radical tradition, which, except for a paper that I presented, had nothing on Black gays or lesbians as part of the Black radical tradition. But in her keynote address, she made a point of affirming the rights of transgender people as part of the gay. So she was affirming gay and lesbian rights and the importance of recognizing transgender people, and then talked about constantly expanding our notion of freedom, was how she put it. And thought I was there. I thought it was an eloquent speech. The audience was uncomfortable with it. And she noticed that and she said something about it. And that's when she said, yes, we have to constantly expand our idea or our notion of freedom. So I think that's what I can respond.
Great. Thank you for that. Thank you for that great question and answer. I have a question. I have a question from Mark Shonker. Mark, if you'd like to ask, you can do so, but if not, I can ask right now. I think it's an interesting question. I'll give it 1 second. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and ask the question. And Mark's question was, as a comparison to the way in which the party treated queer people, what was the attitude towards homosexual promiscuity, heterosexual promiscuity within the party? Is that something we could comment on?
Heterosexual promiscuity?
Yes, correct.
I see. After, okay, I understand the question. Okay. The party had something called a review commission. And it was called the review commission. And when I first started working in the archives at the Tamiment, those files post 1950 were sealed. That committee was originally called the Control Commission, and then the name changed to the Review Commission. But that was the disciplinary arm of the National Communist Party. And so complaints could be filed there, and issues were sorted there in terms of people's behavior or attitudes or contravening party policy and that sort of thing. So, as I said, I was originally not allowed, not personal to me, but those files have been sealed. But I asked permission of the Communist Party. I got in touch with Sam Webb, who at the time was the chairman of the Communist Party, and he gave me permission. So then I had access to everything. And so I was able to look at those files, and it took a very, very, very long time because I needed to go through every file to see if there was something about homosexuality, that was at the core of what was going on. But in any event, the point about that is you could see through some of the things that were that people wrote in about or were critical of was I don't know if you'd call it promiscuity, but choices of sexual partners in a heterosexual sense. So, for example, one person, I'm not giving any names or anything, it's irrelevant, but one guy was involved with a woman who was a police officer. And that wasn't promiscuous, but there was a relationship, and he was expelled because he refused to give up the relationship, and the feeling was that it compromised the security of the party. There were other cases that I found of domestic violence. And the party took it seriously. It's one of the few organizations on the left that actually took domestic violence seriously, but it didn't do much about it. It would do maybe some comrades would go and see the comrade who was responsible for the domestic violence and talk about it. That said, because I was in the party, I am quite aware of how much, shall I say, fooling around there was, and how much promiscuity and how many extramarital relationships there were, because I know that. It's not in the files, it's something I know because I grew up in the Communist Party. Nobody said anything about it. There was no, it had nothing to do with party discipline or the party's attitudes or anything like that. Nobody was saying you can't do that. Nobody was saying you can only be in a monogamous relationship and so on. Nobody touched that I know about. And there was just a lot, and that sometimes it resulted in divorce, and sometimes it, I just know. You grow up in it, and you know my parents, and I just know that there was a good deal of promiscuity.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much.
Can I just say, Dennis, I just add that doesn't make the Communist Party unique.
Yeah.
There's a lot of I just want to, this isn't a criticism. I'm just trying to say, people fool around, and sometimes they make poor decisions when they fool around, and sometimes they have a very good time. So That's
All right. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks, everyone. I want to thank everyone for attending. And I wanted to make a quick announcement before we end that we're going to be launching a film series as part of our Peter and Carol Anti-Fascist Education Fund that many of you gave generously to at the end of last year. And so we're going to be starting a film series with a whole series of very interesting films. Please mark your calendar. The first one will be July 16th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Pacific Time, and then there'll be one about approximately every month after that. But the first one will launch on July 16th, and there's more information about it on our website. And it's all via Zoom, not in person. So it's a online film series. So happy Pride, everyone. Thank you again to my colleague Dennis. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Joan. And a very special thanks to our special guest, Bettina Aptheker, for sharing. And again, I recommend the book. If you haven't read it, please get it and read it, everyone. Thanks, Bettina. Thanks, everyone. Happy Pride.